One final topic that we want to talk about, as long as we're talking about cascading style sheets, is units of measure. There are many different ways to specify how much space you intend for different elements in a web page to occupy. And these different ways of specifying that are the units of measure. Here's our CSS style sheet that we're using right now for this website. And this is the web page, and here's the style sheet. You'll notice I've used a few different units of measure. Well, here on this page so far, I've just got M's. Just briefly specify a font size for paragraphs. And we'll start with, say, 12 points, which is a common size. We'll bring that up here. And that's what 12 points looks like in this environment. Now, points technically are supposed to mean a 72nd of an inch, or 72 points in an inch, or 72 and a fraction if you're talking in strict printing terms. And of course, on a computer screen, you might have the same page on a screen of one size and the same page on a screen of another size with a different resolution, a different number of dots per inch. And so points don't always equal points. They may sometimes get close, and they may sometimes just be way, way off, depending on how somebody's got their computer configured, how careful were the people, who designed the display card, just all kinds of different things that could impact the meaning of the word point. And so it's relatively meaningless in this context. And yet, so are many other units of measure. There's inches. You can specify something instead of saying in 12 points, 0.25 inches. And that'll come out to that. Of course, that's not really a quarter of an inch anyway. And when you think about it, what is it that they're talking about, a quarter of an inch? They're talking about the size of a capital letter? Well, it depends on who you talk to, and it depends on the font manufacturer. Many font manufacturers are talking about the distance from the baseline of one line to the baseline of another line. Even what they mean when they say this measurement doesn't always mean the same thing. Many people will say, well, because these other measurements are meaningless in this context, let's talk in terms of pixels. They say 14 pixels. PX is pixels. You can take out that dot, and there's 14 pixels, which seems to be a little bit smaller than 12 points. And so, pixels may be more of an absolute. And in fact, in my own experimenting, even between different browser manufacturers on the same exact computer, 12 pixels doesn't always mean 12 pixels on different browsers. And so, even these measurements aren't exactly portable. So then there's a lot of argument about, which of these units of measure are better. And as usual, I have my own opinions in these things. I like to say that whenever you specify something in absolute terms, in terms of how much space you mean for something to take up on somebody's computer screen, you have to take responsibility for the fact that you're imposing your concepts onto a user who may not really have the same criteria as you do. And I love to cite the example of my father-in-law, who loves his computer. We got him a computer about, 6 or 7 years ago, and he just loves it. And he sits there and he surfs the web, and he's written a book, and he does all these things. And he uses the same browser that I installed on his computer 5 or 6 years ago. He's never seen any reason to upgrade. He has the fonts set to what you and I might consider gargantuan. And when he runs across a website, like maybe a news website that has a piece of news that he wants to see, and they have set the font size to something, like 12 pixels, and he can't read it. And he's deliberately set the fonts larger on his computer to accommodate his particular needs as an older person. And somebody has gone and, basically taken that power away from him. So you might want to think about all of these things when you set the defaults for your web pages, when you set the sizes of the fonts and things on your web pages. And consider using measurements that are relative to the defaults of the user rather than absolute measurements when the design allows for it and when you think that might be appropriate. So keeping all of that in mind, let's just talk about some of the different units of measure that are available. As long as we're talking about relative, we can talk about percentage, font size 100%. And so that is the default size on somebody's computer. You want to make things a little bit smaller? Great, you can say 70%. And you have slightly smaller text, but it's relative to what the default is that the user has specified on their own computer. This leaves them the control while still allowing you to make some stylistic decisions in the design of your website. And, as far as I'm concerned, This internet revolution that we're all part of is about giving power to the people. Now, if you want to be more absolute, and, I'm trying very hard not to make a moral judgment about that, you can use points. There's 12 points, which is what a lot of people use as a default, and that's what it looks like in this environment. It will guaranteed look different in your environment. You can also specify things in terms of pixels, and so here is 12 pixels. We've talked about that. After you've made a decision about your font size, and I'm just going to take this out for now, you'll notice some of the other things that I'm using here, like this indent right here. This indent is in terms of M's, and I've set that to 1 M. Now, what an M is, the width of the capital letter M, at least that's what it's supposed to be. And so that's a horizontal measurement, M's. And so you might want that indent to be, say, 2 M's. And give it a little bit more of an indent there. And again, it's relative. If you set it to pixels, you might find that somebody else has overridden your font decisions and that it just doesn't look right. So you're setting it relative to the size of the font on the page, which I think makes a lot of sense. Now, we might also want to set the leading. Leading is the space between the lines, and that's often measured in X's. So you can say line height, say 3EX. EX is X, and X is the height of a lowercase x. Another way to specify that is in percent, and that would be percent of the default line height. And so 140% often looks good. And you see it's just about the same as the 3x. And these are the sorts of properties that are going to make your pages very readable. Now, I often like the serif fonts, but in print, serif fonts are usually easier to read. Sometimes online, sans serif fonts are easier to read. And so look what happens here. And we mentioned this a long time ago in the course. But it's sometimes useful to, instead of specifying an absolute font, to simply specify a sans serif font, because on different platforms, different fonts are available, and when a person sets up their browser, they may have selected which fonts are to be the default for sans serif and for the different classes of fonts like that. And so again, leaving the power in the hands of the user. Arial and Helvetica may not look very good on some people's computers. I know that one of my computers runs a version of X Windows that just doesn't have very good fonts like that, but it does have some other more obscure sans serif fonts that look real good. And even on my Windows machine, I really like the look of Tahoma, which is very much a Windows font, but it's a sans serif font. While we're on the subject of units of measure, there's one other thing you might want to think about, and that is, it's not really a unit of measure, but when you're specifying fonts, you might want to think about the defaults that the user has set on their computer already. And so oftentimes what I'll do is, instead of specifying a particular font, I'll specify one of the classes of fonts like serif or sans serif. And that way, whatever it is that the user has specified for their defaults for sans serif and serif fonts, I think most browsers today allow you to set defaults for those. The user has set those defaults because they work well on their computer. Oftentimes, I know that on one of my computers, which runs an old version of X Windows, there is no good Helvetica. The Helvetica just looks really crappy. But there's another sans serif font that's something obscure that I don't remember the name of, but I've got that set as the default for sans serif. So sites that specify sans serif like this will get that font that looks reasonable on my machine. And on my Windows machine, I have it set to Tahoma, which is on Windows machines is a very good readable sans serif font. It's readable at many different sizes, and that's what it looks like. So even if you are going to specify particular fonts, say Tahoma, Verdana, use as your last option sans serif, or if they're serif fonts, then serif. That way, at least you know that something reasonable is going to come up on the user's screen, and you've got a default to fall back on there. And finally, while we're on the subject of all of these units of measure, I want to talk a little bit about testing. It's very important that when you create a page, using style sheets especially, that you test it on as many different platforms as you can and on as many different browsers as you can, or as you think your users might be using. On some of the older versions, and not even that old, like on version 5.0 of Internet Explorer, I seem to remember, if you're specifying font sizes in percentages, it's very easy to get unreadable by going even little amounts under 100%. And different things like this, they vary between browsers and even sometimes between Mac and Windows platforms. So if you have the opportunity to test your page, especially if you're making a lot of fine adjustments to the sizes of things and such, to test your pages on a number of different platforms, send it off to a bunch of friends and have them test it for you and tell you what they think. Join one of the web design mailing lists, ask for people to review your site. Things like this are going to provide a lot of valuable feedback that'll let you know just how readable your site is going to be with your style sheets and with the design decisions that you've made. So that completes our discussion of style sheets. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface of what style sheets can do. If you're interested in the subject, I strongly recommend the course by Chris Deutsch on style sheets, which ought to be very, very good. And there's also books. We have a chapter on it in our Creative HTML book, and you can go to the w3.org website. And also somewhere on my website, I've got a mirror of a really, really good CSS reference by a guy named Brian Wilson, not the same Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, a different Brian Wilson. And I think that's also available at blueberry.com. That concludes the CSS portion of this course. Stay tuned for the next part.